May 14th, 1940, Rotterdam. The sky turned black at 2 in the afternoon. Hendrika van der Meer stood in her classroom in Utrecht, 20 miles away, and heard the distant rumble. It sounded like thunder, but the sky had been clear that morning. She walked to the window. Her students, 30 children between ages 8 and 12, stopped their arithmetic lessons and turned their heads toward the sound. The rumbling grew louder. Then it stopped. An eerie silence followed. Hendrika felt her stomach twist. She had heard whispers that morning. German forces had crossed the border 5 days ago. Everyone said the Dutch military would hold them back for weeks. The radio had promised this. The newspapers had promised this. Netherlands had stayed neutral in the Great War. Surely that would count for something now. At 3 o'clock, the school principal knocked on her door. His face was pale. He gathered all the teachers in the hallway and spoke in a whisper. Rotterdam had been bombed. The entire city center was gone. 900 civilians dead in 15 minutes. 80,000 people had no homes. The words did not make sense to Hendrika. An entire city could not just disappear. But the principal's hands were shaking. He dismissed school early. The children ran home through the streets, their faces confused and frightened. Hendrika walked home slowly. Her husband, Willem, was somewhere with his unit near the Belgian border. He had left 3 days ago with his rifle and his courage. He had kissed her goodbye and promised the Germans would never reach Utrecht. The Dutch had flooded the lowlands, he said. The water barriers would stop the tanks. The military leaders had a plan. Everything would be fine, but everything was not fine. When Hendrika reached her small apartment, she turned on the radio. She sat at the kitchen table and waited. The clock on the wall ticked. 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes. Then the announcement came. The voice on the radio was steady but tired. General Winkelmann was speaking. The Netherlands military was laying down its weapons. After 5 days of fighting, the war was over. The Germans had threatened to bomb more cities. Utrecht would be next, then The Hague, then Amsterdam. To save civilian lives, the Netherlands was surrendering. Hendrika stared at the radio. 5 days. They had lasted 5 days. In the Great War, Belgium had fought for 4 years. Poland had fought for a month just last year. But the Netherlands, with its proud history and its promises of neutrality, had fallen in less than a week. She thought of Willem. Was he putting down his rifle right now? Was he ashamed? Was he even alive? She turned off the radio and sat in silence. Outside her window, she heard neighbors talking. Their voices were low and angry. 5 days, someone said. Just 5 days and it's over. Another voice answered, "What can we do now? Nothing. There's nothing left." Someone was crying. The shame felt thick in the air, like fog rolling in from the North Sea. For 20 years, the Dutch had told themselves they were safe. They had avoided the Great War. They had stayed neutral. They had believed their water barriers and their small but professional army would be enough. Every expert had said so. Every newspaper had printed reassuring articles. The military leaders had appeared on newsreels looking confident in their pressed uniforms. All of it had been wrong. The Germans had come with paratroopers who dropped from the sky. They had come with dive bombers that screamed as they fell. They had come with a brutality that made neutrality meaningless and water barriers look like puddles. Over 2,000 Dutch soldiers were dead. The entire Air Force had been destroyed in 3 days. Most of the planes never even left the ground. That evening, Hendrika's neighbor, Mrs. de Jong, knocked on her door. The old woman's eyes were red from crying. She had 2 sons in the military. She had heard nothing from either of them. The 2 women sat at the kitchen table and drank weak tea. They did not know what to say. What do you say when your country has vanished in 5 days? Then Mrs. de Jong leaned forward. She had heard something strange, she said. Her nephew worked at the post office. He had been sorting international mail that afternoon when he saw a telegram. It was from the Dutch embassy in London. The telegram said that Canada was mobilizing more troops. Even though France was falling and Belgium had been overrun, Canada was sending more soldiers. They were not stopping. They were not surrendering. They were preparing to keep fighting. Hendrika felt something strange in her chest. It was not quite hope. It was more like a question. She looked at Mrs. de Jong and asked quietly, "If Canada fights on, why couldn't we?" The words felt dangerous to say out loud. They felt like a betrayal of the generals who had ordered the surrender, but they also felt true. Mrs. de Jong said nothing. She just looked down at her tea. But Hendrika saw something in the old woman's face. It was the same question, the same small rebellion against the shame. Across Utrecht, across all of the Netherlands, in thousands of apartments and houses, the same question was being whispered. The Dutch military had laid down its weapons. The government had surrendered. The experts had been wrong about everything. But somewhere across the ocean, a country most Dutch people had barely thought about was refusing to quit. Canada was fighting on while the Netherlands fell silent under German boots. And in that contrast, in that gap between surrender and resistance, something began to grow in the hearts of ordinary people. It was small and fragile and dangerous. It was the first spark of defiance. The question Hendrika asked would be asked 10,000 times in the coming weeks, and slowly, quietly, in whispered conversations and secret meetings, some people would begin to find their answer. The German soldiers marched through Utrecht in perfect rows. Their boots hit the cobblestones in rhythm. Hendrika watched from behind her curtains. She had been doing this for 3 weeks now, watching and waiting. Willem had come home after the surrender. He would not talk about what happened at the front. He sat in their apartment and stared at the wall. His rifle was gone. His unit was dissolved. His country was occupied. But something else was happening in the darkness. Mrs. de Jong knocked on Hendrika's door one evening after curfew. The old woman looked nervous. She carried a small object wrapped in cloth. Inside Hendrika's kitchen, with the curtains drawn tight, Mrs. de Jong unwrapped it. A radio. Not the official German-approved radio that sat in Hendrika's living room. This was smaller, hidden, illegal. The Germans had ordered all Dutch citizens to turn in their radios or register them. Only approved stations could be heard. But Mrs. de Jong's nephew at the post office had kept this one. He was sharing it with trusted neighbors. That night, Hendrika and Willem huddled close to the small radio. They kept the volume so low they had to press their ears against the speaker. At 9 o'clock they heard it, a voice speaking Dutch. It came from London, from the BBC. The voice was clear and strong. It told them news the German newspapers would never print. Canadian forces had evacuated from France. They had escaped at Dunkirk. They were regrouping in England. They were training. They were preparing. They had not given up. Then another voice came on. Hendrika gasped. It was Queen Wilhelmina, their queen who had fled to London when the Germans invaded. Her voice trembled with emotion as she spoke. She praised the Canadian resolve. She said that even though the Netherlands had fallen, the spirit of the Dutch people had not. She urged them to hope. She urged them to remember who they were. She said that one day they would be free again. Willem looked at Hendrika. For the first time in 3 weeks, his eyes were not empty. He squeezed her hand. The next morning, Hendrika went to school. She taught her students their lessons. But in her mind, she kept hearing the Queen's voice. She kept thinking about Canada fighting on. At lunch, she whispered to another teacher, a young woman named Anna. Did Anna know about the BBC broadcasts? Anna's eyes grew wide. Then she nodded slowly. Yes, her brother listened too. There were others, they were careful. They only told people they trusted. By August, the whispers had grown into something more. Hendrika learned there were groups forming, small groups. 4 people here, 6 people there. They called themselves resistance cells, though they did not use that word out loud. They met in basements, in attics, in back rooms of shops. They were not soldiers. They were teachers and shopkeepers and factory workers. But they were doing something. They were refusing to cooperate. Hendrika joined a group that met in a baker's cellar. There were 5 others. They pooled their money, guilders, not much, a few coins each week. The baker, a man named Peter, spoke quietly. My cousin in England wrote to me. The Canadians are training day and night. They haven't forgotten us. A factory worker nodded. If they can keep fighting from so far away, we can fight here, in our own way. A young nurse added, every guilder we collect, every paper we print, it's our way of saying we haven't surrendered either. They called it the Orange Fund, named after the Dutch royal family. The money went to families whose men had been arrested. It went to buy food for Jews who were being restricted. It went to support the underground newspapers that were starting to appear. By September, groups like theirs existed in every neighborhood. An estimated 400 cells across the Netherlands. All of them small, all of them secret, all of them inspired by the idea that somewhere, someone was still fighting. The underground newspapers were simple. Printed on cheap paper with hand-cranked machines hidden in attics. The most famous was called Het Parool, which meant the password. It started in September 1940. At first, only a few dozen copies, but by the end of the year, 40,000 people were reading it. The newspapers printed the truth. They told stories about Canadian training exercises, about Allied victories in North Africa, about German losses the official papers never mentioned. Each paper was read and then passed to another trusted person. Each paper reminded the Dutch that they were not alone, that resistance was possible. Hendrika's group did more than collect money. They acted, small acts, careful acts. Hendrika's husband worked in a textile factory that made uniforms for German soldiers. The workers began making mistakes. A sewing machine would break. A shipment would be delayed. Production slowed by 30% over 3 months. When the German supervisors demanded answers, the Dutch foreman shrugged. Equipment failures. What could be done? The Germans suspected sabotage but could prove nothing. In Amsterdam, the resistance grew bolder. February 1941. The Germans began arresting Jews in the old Jewish quarter, rounding them up like cattle. On February 25th, the dock workers refused to work. They just stopped, walked off the docks. 300,000 workers across Amsterdam joined them. It was the first major strike in occupied Europe, the largest protest against Nazi treatment of Jews anywhere. For 2 days, Amsterdam was silent except for the sound of people walking in the streets, standing together, refusing to move. Hendrika heard about the strike on the BBC. Her heart swelled with pride. She whispered to Willem, "They're fighting back. Our people are still fighting." Willem nodded. "Canada showed us it was possible," he said. Then came the news of the cost. 9 strike leaders were taken to a field outside the city and shot. 400 more were arrested and sent to camps in Germany. The strike was crushed with violence, but everyone knew what it meant. The Dutch spirit had not died. The example Canada had set, fighting on when others fell, had taken root. It had grown into something the Germans could beat down, but never fully destroy. By the end of 1941, Hendrika's resistance cell had grown to 12 people. They helped hide Allied pilots who had been shot down over the Netherlands. They created false identity papers for Jews. They distributed the underground newspapers. Every act was small. Every act was dangerous. The penalty for resistance was death. Hendrika knew this. They all knew this. But they kept going because they had learned something important. Surrender of weapons did not require surrender of will. The Dutch military had laid down its guns, but the Dutch people were learning to fight in new ways. Ways that did not need tanks or planes. Ways that required only courage and the memory that somewhere across the ocean, people who barely knew them had refused to quit. And if Canada would not quit, neither would they. By 1943, everything had changed. The small groups that met in basements had become a network. Over 25,000 Dutch civilians were now part of organized resistance. They had learned to move in shadows. They had learned to trust carefully. They had learned to fight without firing a single shot. Hendrika's cell had expanded beyond anything she imagined that first night, listening to the illegal radio. They now coordinated with other cells across Utrecht and beyond. They had contacts in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague. The whispered hope from 1940 had become organized defiance. The resistance specialized in hiding people. Allied pilots whose planes had been shot down over Dutch territory needed to escape back to England. The resistance built secret routes, safe houses connected like beads on a string, stretching from the crash sites to the coast. Hendrika's apartment became one of these safe houses. She and Willem hid 17 different airmen over 2 years. Most were British or American. 2 were Canadian. The Canadians stayed for 3 weeks, waiting for false papers. They told Hendrika stories about training camps in England, about how Canadian forces had grown from a small group in 1940 to a full army, about how they promised to return and liberate the Netherlands. Hendrika fed them from her meager rations. She taught them basic Dutch phrases so they could pretend to be deaf mutes if stopped by German patrols. Then she passed them to the next safe house, and they moved one step closer to freedom. The numbers were staggering. By 1943, the Dutch resistance had helped over 1,500 Allied airmen escape. Each one represented dozens of Dutch civilians risking their lives. Each one was a small victory against the occupation. But the resistance did more than hide pilots. They hid Jews. When the Germans began systematic deportations in 1942, the resistance responded. They created hiding places in attics, behind false walls, in secret rooms beneath shops. Hendrika's neighbor, Mrs. de Jong, hid a Jewish family of 4 in her attic for 18 months. The family never went outside, never saw sunlight, lived on whatever food Mrs. de Jong could spare from her ration cards. 4,000 Jews were hidden this way across the Netherlands. Not enough. Over 100,000 Dutch Jews would die in the camps. But 4,000 lived because ordinary people chose resistance over compliance. The Germans knew they were losing control. Their reports back to Berlin grew frustrated. One document, intercepted by the resistance and printed in Het Parool, said this: "The stubborn hope that Canada and the Allies will liberate them makes governance nearly impossible. The Dutch refuse to accept their place in the new order. The Germans responded with terror. They made examples. They conducted raids. They offered rewards for information about resistance members. 22,000 Dutch civilians would be executed during the occupation for resistance activities. 22,000 people who chose to fight in the only way they could. Hendrika saw the cost up close. In the spring of 1943, someone betrayed their cell. The Gestapo came at dawn. Hendrika and Willem were not home. They had been at a midnight meeting and were sleeping at Anna's house, but they arrested 6 members of their group. Hendrika learned the names slowly. The baker who had hosted their first meetings, a postal worker, a school teacher from another district, 2 factory workers, a nurse. They were taken to a prison in Amsterdam. 3 were sent to camps in Germany and never returned. 3 were shot after a brief trial. The baker, the kind man who had given Hendrika day-old bread to feed the hidden airmen, was executed on his 52nd birthday. The danger became more real every day, but the resistance continued. They adapted. They became more careful. They created smaller cells so that if one was caught, others would survive. They developed code words and secret signals. A flower pot in a certain window meant safe. A closed curtain at noon meant danger. They moved constantly, never meeting in the same place twice. Then came the winter of 1944. It would be remembered as the Hunger Winter, the Hunger Winter. The Germans, angry at Dutch resistance and Allied advances, blocked food supplies to the Western Netherlands. The trains stopped running. The barges stopped moving. Cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam, which depended on food from the countryside, began to starve. Rations dropped to 400 calories per day, then 300, then less. People ate tulip bulbs. They stripped bark from trees and boiled it into soup. They burned their furniture to stay warm because there was no coal. Hendrika grew thin. Everyone grew thin. She could see the bones in William's face. Her students came to school pale and weak. Some stopped coming because they were too hungry to walk. One morning, standing in a bread line, Hendrika overheard 2 elderly women talking. "Do you think the Canadians will really come?" one asked. The other replied, "They promised in 1940 they would keep fighting. They're still fighting now. That means something." The first woman nodded slowly. "Then we keep going too. We don't give the Germans the satisfaction of breaking us." By the time the winter ended in April 1945, over 20,000 Dutch civilians had starved to death. Hendrika attended funerals every week. She watched Mrs. de Jong bury her husband, who died because he gave his food to the Jewish family hiding in the attic. The old woman stood at the grave with hollow eyes, but she did not cry. She told Hendrika that he died doing what was right. That was enough. Through all of this, the resistance never stopped. Even starving, they continued their work. They distributed illegal newspapers. They hid people. They sabotaged German equipment. They waited for liberation. And in April 1945, it came. The 1st Canadian Army crossed into the eastern Netherlands. The news spread through the underground network faster than any newspaper could print it. Canadian soldiers, tanks with maple leaf flags, coming to fulfill the promise they had made 5 years ago. Hendrika heard about the advance on April 12th. She stood in her apartment, thinner than she had ever been, wearing clothes that hung loose on her frame, and she cried. Not from sadness, from relief, from vindication. Canada had not forgotten them. The distant country that had inspired that first dangerous question in 1940 was here, actually here, keeping the promise to fight on. By the end of April, Canadian forces were in Utrecht. Hendrika stood on her street with thousands of other Dutch civilians. They had sewn orange flags in secret, hiding them for years, waiting for this moment. Now the flags hung from every window. The Canadian tanks rolled down the cobblestone streets. Soldiers sat on top, smiling, waving, throwing chocolate and cigarettes to the crowds. The Dutch people surged forward. Old women kissed the soldiers' hands. Children climbed on the tanks. Men who had fought in secret for 5 years openly wept. One man grabbed a Canadian soldier and said through tears, "You kept your word. When our own government surrendered, you never stopped. We remembered that every single day." A woman holding her child shouted, "We told our children about Canada. We said they're coming. They promised. And you came. Hendrika pushed through the crowd until she reached a tank. A young Canadian soldier, barely 20 years old, sat on the turret. His uniform was dusty, his face was tired, but he was smiling. Hendrika looked up at him and said in broken English, "Thank you for not stopping. Thank you for remembering us." The soldier looked confused. Then another Dutch woman explained. Canada had fought on when the Netherlands fell. That had given them hope. That had started the resistance. The soldier's eyes filled with tears. He reached down and shook Hendrika's hand. "We promised we'd come back," he said. "We keep our promises." On May 5th, 1945, the Germans in the Netherlands officially surrendered. 175,000 Canadian troops were spread across the country. They brought food, they brought medicine, they brought liberation. The cost had been terrible. 2,300 Canadian soldiers were buried in Dutch soil. They had died freeing a country most of them had never seen before the war, but they had done it. They had kept fighting when others surrendered, and the Dutch had never forgotten. The war ended, but the memory did not. Hendrika stood in the ruins of Rotterdam in June 1945 and looked at the Canadian soldiers helping to rebuild. They carried bricks. They distributed food from massive supply trucks. They played with Dutch children who had forgotten what it meant to laugh. The statistics of what the Netherlands had endured were almost too large to understand. 210,000 Dutch civilians had died during the occupation, some in executions, some in camps, some from starvation during that terrible final winter. But the resistance had saved thousands more, the pilots who made it home, the Jews who survived in hiding. The small victories that added up to something larger than anyone had imagined in those dark days of 1940. Hendrika returned to teaching in September 1945. Her classroom had broken windows and water damage, but it was still standing. Her students were different now, thinner, quieter, older in ways that children should not be. On the first day, she did not teach mathematics or Dutch grammar. She taught them about Canada. She showed them on a map how far away it was, across an entire ocean. She told them how Canada had refused to surrender when the Netherlands fell, how that refusal had given ordinary Dutch people the courage to resist, how Canadian soldiers had kept their promise to return. The children listened with wide eyes. One boy raised his hand. His father had died in the resistance. He asked if the Canadian soldiers were coming back. Hendrika said no. Most of them were going home now. The boy looked sad. Then Hendrika added, "But we will never forget them, and we will make sure you never forget them either." That promise became something bigger than one classroom. In 1946, Dutch families began organizing ceremonies. Small gatherings at first. A few people laying flowers at the Canadian Military Cemetery in Holland, where 2,300 Canadian soldiers were buried. The graves were marked with simple white crosses and maple leaf emblems. Dutch volunteers came to maintain the grounds. They pulled weeds. They planted flowers. They polished the markers. Some families adopted specific graves. They would visit on birthdays and anniversaries. They would leave notes and flowers for soldiers they had never met but would never forget. Hendrika adopted the grave of Private James Morrison from Toronto. He had died on April 16, 1945, just days before Utrecht was fully liberated. He was 19 years old. Every year, on April 16th, Hendrika visited his grave. She brought tulips, orange ones when she could find them. She told him about the Netherlands he had helped save, how the country was rebuilding, how children were growing up free because of what he did. She spoke to the White Cross as if he could hear her. Maybe he could. Maybe the dead know when they are remembered. The tradition spread. By the 1950s, thousands of Dutch civilians were participating in annual remembrance ceremonies. Canadian veterans began returning to visit. They were treated like heroes. Families invited them into their homes, fed them the best meals they could afford, showed them the hiding places where they had sheltered Allied pilots, took them to the sites where resistance members had been executed. The Canadians were often quiet during these visits. Many cried. They had not known the full story of Dutch resistance during the war. They had not realized how much their decision to keep fighting had meant to occupy civilians. Willem and Hendrika hosted 3 Canadian veterans in their home in 1952. One of them, a man named Thomas from Manitoba, had fought in the liberation of Utrecht. He walked through their neighborhood and kept stopping, kept staring. He told them he remembered these streets from April 1945, but then they had been empty and dangerous. Now children played on them, women hung laundry, shops were open. He turned to Willem and said, "This is why we came. This is why it mattered." That night over dinner, Thomas asked about the Dutch resistance. Willem told him everything about the underground newspapers, the safe houses, the sabotage, the executions, the starvation. Thomas listened without interrupting. When Willem finished, Thomas was silent for a long time. Then he said, "We thought we were liberating you, but you were already fighting. You just didn't have guns." By the 1960s, Hendrika had become a history teacher. She made it her mission to ensure every student learned about the war, not just the facts and dates, the why. Why the Netherlands fell in 5 days. Why that mattered. Why Canada's refusal to surrender had changed everything. She taught them about resistance, about how ordinary people with no military training had fought back in the only ways they could. She brought in veterans, both Dutch and Canadian. She took students to the cemeteries. She made them understand that freedom was not free, that it required sacrifice, that their country existed because people had been willing to die for it. The bond between the Netherlands and Canada grew stronger with each generation. Dutch children learned Canadian geography in school. They learned about maple syrup and ice hockey. When Canadian veterans visited, schools would close so children could line the streets and wave flags. The veterans, now old men, would wave back with tears in their eyes. Some Dutch families saved money for years to visit Canada, to see the country that had saved theirs, to shake hands with Canadians and say thank you in person. The numbers told the story. By the year 2000, over 75,000 Dutch civilians visited the Canadian war cemeteries in the Netherlands every year. Every single grave was adopted by a Dutch family. Not one Canadian soldier buried in Dutch soil was forgotten. The tradition passed from grandparents to parents to children. New generations took up the responsibility. They learned the names, they learned the stories. They kept the promise Hendrika had made in 1945. Hendrika herself lived until 1998. She was 91 years old. She had taught history for 40 years. She had visited Private Morrison's grave every April 16th for 53 years. In her final years, her students would push her wheelchair to the cemetery. She could barely see, but she knew the way by heart. She would sit by the White Cross and tell James Morrison about the New Netherlands, about the European Union, about prosperity and peace, about how his sacrifice had made all of it possible. Her last visit was April 16th, 1998. She died 3 months later. At her funeral, a Canadian flag was draped alongside the Dutch flag. A Canadian veteran, now 94 years old, traveled from Vancouver to attend. He stood at her grave and saluted. The lesson of 1940 lived on. It was not a lesson about military strategy or political alliances. It was deeper than that. It was about human nature. about what happens when one group of people refuses to abandon another, even when the cost is high and the outcome uncertain, about how hope can be a weapon more powerful than bombs, about how the choice to keep fighting, to not surrender to darkness, can inspire others to find their own courage. The Dutch learned in 1940 that distance does not determine duty, that Canada, a nation across an ocean, could matter more to their survival than their own government surrender. They learned that resistance begins with a question, a dangerous, whispered question in a kitchen after curfew. If they fight on, why can't we? That question changed everything. It led to 25,000 civilians joining the resistance, to 4,000 Jews hidden and saved, to 1,500 Allied pilots returned to the fight, to a people who refused to let occupation destroy their spirit. And it all began because Canada would not quit, because somewhere in the darkness of May 1940, when Europe was falling and hope seemed lost, a distant nation said no. We will keep fighting. We will not forget you. We will come back. And they did. And the Dutch remembered. And 70 years later, their children still lay flowers on Canadian graves and whisper thank you to soldiers who never went home. Because some debts can never be repaid, only honored, only remembered, only passed down through generations as a reminder of what humanity looks like when it refuses to surrender to evil.